that entire distance that is there, this right here, there are many things that can go wrong that allow the movement of that impairs the movement of gas from the alveolus to the erythrocyte and the CO2 going in the opposite direction. And that's what we're going to kind of focus on today, are the things that affect diffusion. Okay. So we know that there's this alveolar fluid that is there. There's capillary and there's alveolar epithelium, alveolar type 1 cells, the type 1 pneumocytes. There's a basement membrane. There's an interstitial space. There's a basement membrane for the capillary endothelium, plasma, erythrocyte. And then finally, there actually is a fluid inside the erythrocyte that it still has to move through to get to the hemoglobin, which is ultimately where we'll find the oxygen wants to be. This distance that it has to move to diffuse across is somewhere on the order of 0.36 to 2.5 microns in distance. What, do I really care to know the value now? But just recognize how small of a distance that is. Okay. If we look at an alveolus itself, its diameter is somewhere between 75 and 300 microns. So this is just a fraction of that as far as the distance that it has to move. Very, very small distance. So in most cases, diffusion of gas is rapidly attained. We know that all gas movement is due to a pressure differential, and we know that the pressure differential within the alveolus, the arterial, let me back up here. We said that there's some amount of oxygen which is present within the alveolus. We're going to call that the partial pressure of alveolar oxygen. And that is higher than what is on the venous side. So therefore, oxygen moves from a higher pressure, say 105, to something that's lower. Net effect is that you end up having some amount of oxygen that is higher. We're going to call this the arterial value. Everybody agreeing with me on this? It's just a pressure differential that causes passive diffusion to occur across the alveolar capillary membrane. We said that the venous value was 46. We didn't really talk about this, but that ends up becoming 40, so that my arterial value is again 40. There's an equilibration that exists. It's going to diffuse across until the pressures on either side are the same. Bigger pressure difference in oxygen than there is in carbon dioxide. You have arterial oxygen going from 40. I have this wrong here, don't I? Somebody should have caught me on it. It should be 40. Going from 40 to 100, 60 torr change, versus carbon dioxide, which is going from 46 to 40, only a 6 torr change. That's interesting. Should be kind of the same, shouldn't they? Well, the answer is no, and we'll get to why. All right, couple of very important concepts here. First of all, as this value is moving across, here's my oxygen, there's a limited amount of time that it spends in a position to be able to exchange gases. As the blood is traversing in front of a functional alveoli, there is only 0.75 seconds of time for it to be there. We're going to call that the transit time. Three-quarters of a second is how much time blood sits in front of an alveolus. It's the only amount of time it can do gas exchange, once it's past that alveolus, it no longer can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Transit time, right on the bottom. Capillary transit time. Yes, Randy.
Can you give it that again? I'm sorry.
Of course I can.
Okay, you said the amount of time.
The amount of time that the blood passes in front of a functional alveolus. Because that's the only time gas exchange can happen, right? So if I alter that time, I'm going to alter the ability for oxygen and carbon dioxide to exchange. Okay? But that's called the transit time. Okay? How much time do I have to get my job done? And if you notice, what ends up happening is as it passes by, this lower level now starts increasing. If you also notice, under normal conditions, we only require 0.25 seconds to fully exchange the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So let me say this in English, and then, or let me say it in medicalese, and then we'll say it in English. Normal transit time is 0.75 seconds. Normal diffusion time is 0.25 seconds. So the amount of time that I sit in front of the window to exchange my French fries and money at McDonald's is 0.75 seconds. That's the time that we need to have this transaction happen. I only really need 0.25 seconds. By the time that 0.25 seconds is done, the transaction's done. We're just kind of sitting there chatting with the lady at the register. Okay? There is no more need for additional time, although it's there. Why is it there? Well, what happens if you got disease? What happens if you have something else going on? It's a cushion that you end up having. So even though we have 0.75 seconds available, we're only using a third of that, 0.25 seconds. Okay. Now let's talk about what happens when I have a diffusion defect, something which is impairing the ability of oxygen to get across the alveolar capillary membrane. Okay. In that case, if you'll notice the orange line there, slowed due to a thickened membrane or for whatever reason, now the time it takes to get across the alveolar capillary membrane is a little bit longer. Now it's a half a second to equilibrate. No problem. I got 0.75 seconds. So even though it's taking longer to get across, it's not an issue. I'm cool. I can still get my money out, pay the cashier, get my French fries, and continue on. So far, so good? So diffusion defects impair the ability for oxygen to move across the alveolar capillary membrane, but in most cases it's not a problem clinically because I have that extra cushion that's built in. Make sense so far?
Wait, can you repeat that? Diffusion defect impair what?
Diffusion defect impairs the ability for oxygen to get across the alveolar capillary membrane, but in most cases at rest, it's not a problem because I have that extra cushion. Even though it's now taking 0.5 seconds instead of 0.25 seconds, no big deal. I got 0.75 for God's sakes. I got all kind of time. Oh, yes. Hold that thought for about 8 seconds.
Okay.
That's the next point I'm going to bring up. What was the key word I used there? at rest. Well, what happens if we're not at rest? Now it becomes an issue. So that total transit time is 0.75 seconds. Total diffusion time is 0.25 seconds under normal conditions. And when we have a thickening of that membrane, for whatever reason, it gets a little bit longer. The problem comes when I have an increase in cardiac output, say when I move, when I exercise, when I walk, when you can use your imagination. Now all of a sudden, the transit time is reduced. Uh-oh, what did he just say? Listen closely. As you increase cardiac output, as you increase the flow of blood, the speed at which the blood's going past that alveolus, can you agree with me that the transit time actually goes down? The time spent in front of the alveolus is actually less. If I got my foot on the accelerator driving through the drive-through window, I ain't going to be able to get my french fries. Right? So during exercise, we actually see that transit time dropping down to as low as 0.4 seconds. Under normal conditions, we only need a quarter. Big whoop. I still got the job completed. Unless I got a diffusion defect, where it takes a half a second. In that case, don't have full exchange going on. Go ahead, Randy. 'Cause I know a question's percolating. Have you ever seen a patient with chronic lung disease? Bad end-stage emphysema? Sitting at rest, they're usually okay. It's only when they get to go up to the bathroom that they get winded. They get short of breath. That's why. At rest, the diffusion time is exceeded by the transit time, no big deal. Get them moving and walking, now all of a sudden their cardiac output has to pick up. And now all of a sudden, that transit time gets shorter and shorter until which the diffusion time isn't there. Am I okay on that concept?
So this is saying that during exercise, you can get to a cardiac output where that increases or goes low as 0.4 seconds, but you're still okay at that level.
Under normal conditions,
Okay.
you and I.
So you're healthy.
Under a healthy lung, the diffusion time is still less than the transit time. It's only when you have a situation that you have a defect that comes into play. So at rest, these patients are not hypoxemic. Uh-oh, big word. At rest, their PaO2 is not below normal values. It's only when we exercise them. And one of the things that we'll do, especially to qualify for oxygen at home, because oxygen's a drug, you need a prescription, and Medicare will not reimburse the cost of it unless it's either a documented hypoxemia at rest or they desaturate during exercise. So we'll actually take them for a walk and monitor their oxygen levels, and if we see it drop off, that qualifies them for home O2. Okay. There's multiple reasons why you would end up having this, but in this case, if my transit time becomes so low, the potential exists where this oxygen doesn't get across, doesn't get it fully attached to the hemoglobin. And in that case, what you end up having is somebody who's hypoxemic. And that's the key part to remember. During exercise, during stress, during something that causes the cardiac output to increase and that transit time to decrease, the potential exists for a diffusion defect to be manifested and hypoxemia to develop. that implies that there's something wrong with the diffusion pathway. Something's causing it to take longer to get across than ordinarily would. So what causes this reduction in diffusion? That's the whole question. This is an example of a lung that has pulmonary fibrosis. Those nice rich alveoli, that's gone. Basically looks like Swiss cheese. And that's literally what will end up happening. And I'll explain why in a sec. Okay. Just when you thought it was safe, there's a couple other people that you need to know names of. Never ends, Rob. Never ends. Adolf Fick. Fick comes back into our lives multiple times. He's kind of one of these physiologists that really likes the cardiopulmonary system. And this is his law. The amount of gas that diffuses across the membrane directly proportional to the surface area, the pressure difference from one side of the diffusion constant. What the hell is he talking about? Well, it's really a couple of factors. Let me change colors. How much is diffused is proportional to the surface area, pressure difference, and a constant, which I'll spend a few moments talking about, and inversely proportional to the thickness. Let's talk about each of these. And that's what that bottom says, although it's written funny. If I have 10 alveoli available for diffusion, or I have 1 million alveoli available for diffusion, who do you think is going to have the higher diffusion? The million. Sure. You got more functioning alveoli to participate, more surface area. So if I remove somebody's lung, and I only have one lung, they're going to have less alveoli participating for diffusion. They potentially could have a diffusion defect. In fact, probably will. We didn't really talk in depth about this, but this disease, emphysema, instead of having that cluster of alveoli like a bunch of grapes, it's like a big orange. The adjacent alveolar walls coalesce together, so instead of having 20,000 alveoli, you end up having one big bleh. We actually call it a blub or a bullseye, where it's just one big alveolus. You would think, boy, that'd be better, wouldn't it? No. What actually helps diffusion is having all those grapes with capillaries surrounded. If I just have this one big guy, diffusion goes down. And that's one of the classic diffusion defects we end up seeing is pulmonary emphysema. So loss of surface area causes diffusion to be impaired. Go ahead, Susan.
Do people with emphysema have issues with surfactant?
No. No. Yeah, they're actually the other way around. They inflate really easily. They just never deflate. They just stay inflated. In fact, what we end up seeing long-term wise, and I don't know if Ray or Jeannie have come across this yet, but they actually structurally changed their thoracic cage. So the shape of their thorax, instead of being narrow AP, wide lateral, it becomes round, like a barrel. And they actually call it a barrel chest. Because they trap gas. It just doesn't come back out. So their FRC, big word, their FRC is increased dramatically.
What did you say about loss of surface area?
As you lose surface area, you can't diffuse as much. It's a direct relationship. That's why it's in the numerator.
Do you want us to know this formula at the bottom or just understand this?
This is one, again, you'll never calculate it, but it's very important to understand the theory behind it. Pressure difference. If there's a bigger pressure difference between what's in the alveolus and what's in the blood, what's coming back from the venous side, let me rephrase that. On the pulmonary capillary, how do I want to say this? This side, which is basically a small pulmonary arteriole dumping into the pulmonary capillary. If there's a big difference between point A and point B, there's going to be more diffusion.
Similar surface area.
Similar surface area. Now I'm just talking about the difference in pressures. Bigger pressure difference, well, that should mean I'm going to push more across. And indeed, that is the case. I can improve diffusion by making alveolar PO2 higher. Okay. Even in the face of that diffusion defect, I'm still going to be able to improve. That's why we put patients who have diffusion defect, who are struggling on room air, we put them on oxygen to walk. It now increases their alveolar value, increases their arterial value. They don't feel the loss of oxygen. The inverse thing is thickness. This distance that it has to go across. That the distance between a functional alveoli and a functional capillary, the interstitial space. As that gets wider and wider, as that gets larger, that thickness gets larger, diffusion goes down. It's an inverse relationship. There he goes using those big words. Okay. There's also this constant that is there, which is kind of funky, so let me just talk briefly about this diffusion constant. Each gas, and remember, every gas is unique. The two primary ones we're focusing on are oxygen and carbon dioxide. Well, structurally, they're different. The molecular weights are different. Their properties are different because they have different number of total neutrons that are present. Not to bring 1016 into the picture, but it actually does play in here. But as that gas is moving from the alveolus into the capillary, or from the capillary into the alveolus, they're going from basically at least oxygen in that case, is going from an air-filled environment into a liquid environment. So there's two processes that have to be accounted for. One is movement from that gaseous into a liquid. So I have to jump in the pool. The oxygen molecule has to physically dissolve itself into the liquid. It then has to move through the liquid. And these are two factors that make up this diffusion constant, and they're based upon two different laws, one of which is Henry's law, one of which is Graham's law. Let me go through these, and I'll tell you what I want you to know about them specifically, okay? Because they can get a little bit dry, like most of the stuff is wildly entertaining, I understand, okay? First of all, Henry. Henry talks about the amount of gas that dissolves in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas above, blah, 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 blah. Higher pressure in the alveolus, more is going to be pushed into the alveolar type 1 cell. Remember, type 1 cell really is liquid. The cytoplasm on the inside is considered a liquid, so that gas has to move from the alveolus into the type 1 cell. What determines that is something called a solubility coefficient. Oh, it just sounds like it's a bad word. Think of it as how easy it is to dissolve in a liquid. Think of when you put sugar in your coffee, if you're like me, or cream in your coffee, if you're like me. That cream or sugar has to dissolve into the coffee. Otherwise, it's just sitting like rocks on the bottom. The easier it is to dissolve, heck, cream is a whole lot easier to dissolve than sugar is. Those crystals take a little bit more agitation or whatever else. We would say that cream is more soluble than the sugar. Does that concept make sense? Certain things are going to affect how easy that gas will dissolve into the liquid. And if we look at oxygen, and no, you don't have to memorize that number, and you look at carbon dioxide, oxygen is far more soluble. It's a whole lot easier to put oxygen in to a liquid than it is carbon dioxide. I said that wrong, didn't I? If you look at the numbers, that's wrong. Carbon dioxide is far more soluble, 0.6 milliliters versus 0.02. In fact, it's something like 24 times more soluble. Said that backwards.
Should we know those exact numbers?
No. You just need to know from us. Just hold this thought out. Know what a solubility coefficient means. How easy it is to dissolve, or how hard it is to dissolve. In this case, carbon dioxide would be the cream. Oxygen would be the sugar granules. One's a whole lot more easier to get into solution than the other.
So how easy it is for a gas to dissolve in liquid?
Oh, yes, into a liquid. Henry, into. Henry, into. Henry's talking about dissolving into the liquid. His brother, not really, Graham, has to do with how easily the gas gets through the liquid. And the little analogy that I always use is we go through graham crackers. It's silly, stupid, but you'll remember it. Henry is the guy jumping into the pool. Graham is the swimmer swimming through the pool. And what Graham says is what determines how easily you can swim through the pool is how big you are. The bigger, the harder it is to move through. Well, that makes sense. The more you weigh, the harder it's going to be to swim through the water. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't swim, so it's an academic point. And if you look at the respective gram molecular weights of oxygen and carbon dioxide is the heavier guy. Oh my God, square root, what the hell? Don't worry about it.
If carbon dioxide is easier to enter the water, why is it harder versus oxygen?
Because it's heavier.
Okay, but it's still...
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. You're ahead of me.
So when she said...
Graham's law says that the heavier the molecule, the harder it will be to move through a liquid interface. Henry, into. Graham, through. Henry says there's solubility coefficients. Something's easier or harder to dissolve. Graham's talks about the gram molecular weight, how big they are, how fat they are, how heavy they are. Heavier ones are going to diffuse less. Well, we put them together, and we find that carbon dioxide, that solubility is far more important than the gram molecular weight difference. In other words, the fact that CO2 can dissolve into the liquid is far more important than the fact that it's a bigger molecule. And why is it has to do with the fact that we're taking the square root, but nobody wants to go there. Because that would mean I'd have to have a square root on my calculator. Who cares, right? But the bottom line is that CO2 is 20 times more diffusible than oxygen. Let me say that again. Henry's law, talking about dissolving into the liquid, Graham's law, the gas moving through the liquid, taken together, the net effect is that CO2 is 20 times more diffusible than oxygen. This is why there's only a 6 torr difference in carbon dioxide versus a 60 torr difference for oxygen. Venus PO2 of 40, arterial PO2 of 100, 60 torr difference. Venus CO2 of 46, arterial of 40, 6 torr difference. Why? Because CO2 is more diffusible. Clinically, what this will mean is that you'll see changes in oxygenation problems far sooner than you'll ever see changes in carbon dioxide elimination. So somebody will manifest hypoxemia long before they'll manifest hypercarbia. Oh God, I used a bunch of big words there. O2 will be impaired far sooner or far more quickly than CO2 problems will manifest themselves.
Because it doesn't diffuse as easy.
That's right. That's exactly correct. As far as diffusion defects, at least. Yeah.
Okay, on your overview, you have a couple, two questions, and one of them is, which is the following, diffusion problem partially obstructed airways or reduced? Another question I have.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I suppose I have to come over there. Is that what you're telling me?
I don't know the answer to either of these, so I don't know if that's important or not.
Why does 100% oxygen increase oxygen diffusion rate? Because if I breathe 100% oxygen, I make the alveolar partial pressure higher, bigger partial pressure difference, bigger diffusion. Right? That was one of the things that had to do with Fick's law. In the numerator is a pressure difference. Make that partial pressure difference bigger, more diffusion will happen. What's the second question? The second one. If surface area goes down, I'm going to have an impairment in diffusion. More so than if I have an airway obstruction.
Like, surface area goes down?
If surface area goes down, there's less alveoli there, can't have as much diffusion. Okay. So Henry and Graham's kind of together says that there's different diffusion rates for different gases. That oxygen and carbon dioxide don't diffuse the same. Obviously, one's 20 times more. And it has to do with a combination of those two. That was painful. But let's move on. Clinically, and this is the important part, the important slide that you should be aware of. Fick's law, you're never going to calculate it. Graham's law, you're never going to calculate it. But they come into play. As the surface area decreases, diffusion decreases. Chop out a lung, less diffusion. Lose surface area secondary to that emphysema losing its elasticity and the alveoli coalescing into one big alveolus, less diffusion. Partial pressure, reduce the alveolar pressure, reduce the diffusion. This is what happens in Denver. Partial pressure goes down because barometric pressure has gone down. And the last one, the thickness of the alveolar capillary membrane. This is what we see in some diseases like congestive heart failure, where there's so much fluid on board that the fluid doesn't stay in the pulmonary capillary anymore. It leaks out into the interstitial space. And the interstitial space gets wider and wider and wider. Okay? So we talked about that, the 9 different steps involved. Well, there's 3 of them, basically. Well, 2 of them. Right there.
Should we know the 9 steps?
It's a multiple choice, guys. What am I going to say? Which of the following are... no. But you should just have an idea that gas got to get from point A to point B. That's the important part. All right, let me just leave this alone for right now. I'm not going to ask you anything on it, but basically there's a perfusion limitation to diffusion. There's only so much blood flow that you can end up having, and we talked, that bottom portion is what we end up seeing clinically is a diffusion limitation, where usually surface area is lost, but I'm not going to go anything further on that. One last point that I want you to know. There's a measurement we make in the pulmonary function lab, and it's called DLCO. DLCO. The diffusing capacity of the lung for carbon monoxide. Okay. We think of carbon monoxide as being a bad thing, and it is in large quantities, but it's also a very diffusible gas. So we use it as kind of a tracer gas to be able to assess somebody's diffusing capacity. The normal value for a healthy male, 70 kilograms, blah, 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 our fictitious normal is 25 milliliters per minute per millimeter of mercury of carbon monoxide. 25 milliliters per minute per millimeter of mercury. That's the normal value. I believe that's one of your objectives. Now, this value is going to vary, obviously. If I have somebody who's 4'8" versus somebody who's 6'4", they're going to have different diffusing capacities because they got different sized lungs inside that thoracic cage. As we age, we actually start losing alveoli, functioning alveoli. You young whippersnappers have a whole lot more than I do. As we change body position, our lung inflates differently as we lie down versus as we sit up. That's going to affect it. One of the big ones is the amount of hemoglobin that you end up having. And there are adjustments that are made to this measurement based upon lung volume, based upon hemoglobin value. But we'll get to that some other year. We know that this value is decreased when I have a reduction in the surface area, as I mentioned with emphysema, or in the conditions where you end up having a thickness of that membrane being increased, as you would end up seeing in pulmonary fibrosis, where the alveoli themselves become scarred. If you think about it, when you have a cut and you get a scar that comes over, that scab that's there, imagine that being your alveolar lining. Ooh, it's not going to be too easy to diffuse through when they got all this crud in the way. And as we talked about, with congestive heart failure, what ends up happening, instead of having this alveolus that's proximal to the pulmonary capillary, I end up having a bigger distance that it has to travel. Make that distance too big, and you're going to get all the way across in that 3/4 of a second that I got. This takes too long. Okay, I like this one. All right, let's do this. I have a little practice test for